This is the Insight Meditation community of Charlottesville. In case anyone is not aware, we're really glad to have you here. So we have a really special guest tonight, and a lot of us have read her book. It's Be the Refuge, Raising the Voices of Asian American Buddhists. This is Chenxing Han with us tonight. So thank you all for being here. It's really lovely to have everyone together. Our evening is really exciting because it involves a lot of community engagement. Chenxing has been very generous with her time and really wants a lot of engagement with us. So I'm going to introduce our guest, Chenxing Han. She'll speak for a brief bit about her book, and then we'll really open it up to questions. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce you, Chenxing. Chenxing is a Bay Area-based writer, for those of you who don't know, whose publications have appeared in Buddha Dharma, Journal of Global Buddhism, Lion's Roar, Tricycle, and elsewhere. She holds a BA from Stanford and an MA in Buddhist Studies from the Graduate Theological Union. After studying chaplaincy at the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, California, she worked in spiritual care at a nearby community hospital in Oakland. Her book, which I already referenced, but perhaps for those of you who joined later, Be the Refuge, was published this past January. And another note that everyone might not be aware of is that Chenxing was one of the co-organizers of the ceremony that we watched as a Sangha last Tuesday, May We Gather, which was a response to the shootings in Atlanta in March. It was a memorial for Asian American ancestors in response to the long history of anti-Asian sentiment that we have experienced in this country. So Chenxing, thanks so much for your efforts and for being here, and very warm welcome from all of us.
Thank you so much, Liz, for the invitation to speak with you all and for guiding that beautiful meditation. It was so moving to hear a land acknowledgement and also an acknowledgement of Asian ancestors of Buddhism. And thank you also to Judy for hosting and to all of you just for being here. I'm just overwhelmed to see all these smiling faces and am really moved to know that many of you participated last Tuesday in the May We Gather live stream that IMCC helped stream, I guess, bring all of you together and have discussion as well. I suppose since I can't see you, I love the video format for that. Can I just see a quick show of hands of how many people were able to attend last Tuesday? Oh, wonderful. Thank you all so much for joining us. And just so I know that there was an All Sangha Big Read, which I was very honored and surprised to find that for the book as well. And how many of you have been able to read some or all of the book? Oh, wow. This is so wonderful. Okay, so hopefully what I share very briefly will not be too redundant. I think that for those of you who haven't read the book, it has kind of a long history that I talk a little bit about in the book itself. Back around, I think it was, 2011 or 2012, I was starting a master's program at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, and I was poking around for a thesis topic. And through various causes and conditions, it occurred to me that there wasn't really any research on Asian American Buddhists as a group that includes a really broad diversity of ethnicities as well as of different Buddhist traditions. So a sort of pan-ethnic and also pan-Buddhist group. And that got me started on interviews. I ultimately ended up interviewing 89 young adults of different ethnic and Buddhist backgrounds. And all of that got woven into this book that is in many ways, I suppose people have called it a rather genre defying, or I like to think of it as a kind of genre fluid book. There's elements of scholarship and elements of ethnography, but also of memoir of my own story. Those parts were harder to put in. It took many years for me to be comfortable enough to really write more of my own story into the book. And the book is very much built on conversations. So I think that that's why it really delights me when we can have this format where we can all be in conversation together, learn from each other just by listening to each other's stories. And I thought that I would read just a brief section of the book. I was thinking about May 4th and thinking how much I would have loved for my friend Aaron Lee to have been there. So some of you will know that Aaron, is a photo of him here, back in 2009 started a blog called the Angry Asian Buddhist Blog, which is a pretty provocative title. We don't think of Asian Americans as angry, and we especially don't think of Buddhists as angry. But what Aaron was really wanting to do, he was first, the title was a spoof off the blog Angry Asian Man, which is a blog on Asian American issues that's been even longer running. And Aaron wanted to bring to the fore issues of race and representation in American Buddhism. In particular, he was really struck by the dissonance between mainstream representation of American Buddhism, which would suggest that it's predominantly white, and then the statistics. So, for example, from the Pew Forum in 2012, we know that over 2/3 of American are of Asian heritage. So he very boldly, though anonymously, hence the moniker Angry Asian Buddhist, decided to write on these issues. And really tragically, Aaron passed away in 2017 of cancer at the age of 34. But I know he always wanted to see a gathering of Asian American Buddhists from different lineages, indeed American Buddhists from different lineages. And I just think how much he would have celebrated, I think both mourned and celebrated with us, how those two things are often so intertwined, but the May 4th gathering. So I wanted to read just from chapter 3 of my book. It's titled Lineage. And this is when I actually met Aaron for the first time in person. So my thesis advisor put me in touch with Aaron via email. And I was honestly really quite terrified because I thought he'd be really mean and really angry. But as you can see from the photo I showed, he's just one of the kindest and most generous people I've ever met. So I thought I would read a little bit from the book, and this also gives you a little bit of a sense of how I went about conducting these interviews. A few hours before Techno Buddha 2013 is slated to begin, and this is a young adult Buddhist conference that's been running for several years now, sponsored by the Jodo Shin tradition. Sorry, I should have mentioned that from the start. So a few hours before Techno Buddha 2013 is slated to begin, I am nervously rearranging vegan cookies at the kitchen table. My seventh interviewee is on his way to the Berkeley apartment where my partner Trent and I live. I told our guests to look for the overgrown bougainvillea and apologize in advance for the broken doorbell. The most recent interview for my master's thesis, conducted a week ago at this very kitchen table, went well. Born and raised in the Bay Area, Alyssa recently started exploring Buddhist teachings and practice. Her religious upbringing had been very agnostic, at times atheist, though her mother grew up praying to Guanyin. Alyssa was back in California for spring break during a year-long stint as an English teacher at a college for Buddhist monastics in China. Struggling to understand her place in American Buddhism, she did a Google search and stumbled across my project. Our animated conversation spanned nearly 4 hours. A rap on the window announces the arrival of interviewee number 7. It's hard to believe we are finally meeting in person after half a year of exchanging emails. I opened the door to a megawatt smile, fueled by 3 hours of sleep, half an hour of morning meditation, and more cups of coffee than he dares remember. Aaron is ready to dive into our interview. 5 hours later, the table holds a plate of crumbs, a stack of scribbled on papers, and a voice recorder that ran out of batteries mid-interview. Indefatigable, Aaron heads straight over to Techno Buddha. I promised to be there right after I finished jotting down notes from our conversation. Can you tell me a bit about the importance of Buddhism in your life? Aaron half groans, half laughs. It's so interwoven with everything in my life, it's sort of annoying for people. It hasn't always been that way. Aaron's dad went to a Catholic school, identified as Buddhist for a time, then converted to Judaism after marrying his mom. They raised their son Jewish. Aaron started meditating after moving from the Bay Area to Illinois during high school. The meditation led him to read up on Buddhism in an actual encyclopedia. The internet in 1998 was not what it is now. Was there even Wikipedia then? Aaron wonders. We resist the urge to consult our phones during the interview, so I look it up later. Nope, not until 2001. Even without checking his phone, Aaron brings up enough names during our conversation to populate multiple Buddhist basketball teams. One of Aaron's Jewish classmates in high school was really into Buddhism. Aaron tells me how he went up to Jared during drama rehearsal, having pored over the encyclopedia the previous day, just to see if I could sort of mess with him. Hey, Jared, I read about bodhisattvas. I'm a bodhisattva. Jared paused, then calmly replied, We all are. Aaron was stunned. My mind's like, poof, explosion. What does that mean? I really had to learn about this. As an undergrad at the University of California, Los Angeles, Aaron helped found the University Buddhist Association. And the rest is history, he says with a cheeky grin. Back in college, when Aaron didn't have a car, another UCLA student offered to drive him downtown and show him around. That classmate had grown up in the Sacramento Betsuin of the BCA and introduced Aaron to Jodo Shinshu. Later, while earning a master's degree in Illinois, Aaron connected with the Buddhist Temple of Chicago and the Midwest Buddhist Temple. When MBT hosted the Eastern Buddhist League, Aaron volunteered to shuttle people to and from the airport and got to know a lot more Shin Buddhists in the process. Aaron felt an affinity for Japanese American Buddhists. I come from an Asian American community that also has deep roots in the US, though admittedly he had only met a handful of Toisanese Buddhists. As a mixed Ashkenazi Jewish Toisanese American, Aaron recognized there isn't really a cultural niche for me. That didn't stop him from volunteering at Shin Buddhist churches. Aaron cherished these multi-generational sanghas, even if they didn't emphasize meditation, which was central to his own Buddhist practice. He defended these communities against those who dismissed them as mere social clubs. Something he always appreciated, there's no cost to entry. You just show up and you're part of the community. And I'll skip ahead and just read one more really short section from our interview together. What are 3 things you would want people to know about Asian American Buddhists? It takes Aaron a full 10 minutes to work out his answer to this interview question. He would want to make sure that people had an understanding of Buddhism first, but he wouldn't want that understanding to be reduced to a soundbite. I don't actually know what I would want people to know about Buddhism. I think I would want something that all Buddhists would be happy with, and I don't know if you could find that. That's why the diversity is really important. Aaron ventures a possibility. Maybe the Four Noble Truths? But then he decides it can't just be reduced to that, given the reaction he's heard in some quarters. Quote, Buddhists are pessimists who hate life. Finally, upon further deliberation, Aaron relents and offers a soundbite. Understand that Asian Americans are interwoven into the history of Buddhism in the United States, going back well over a century. Thank you.
Thanks, Chenxing. So I have a question that I'd like to start off with, and then we'll open it up to all questions. And I think the passage that you shared is a great segue. I was watching an interview that you gave recently with the author of American Dharma, Anne Gleig, and she asked you the significance of the title for you, Be the Refuge, and I know that or you shared that Aaron that was his kind of wording originally. But then I wanted to read a quote that you offered during that interview. You said that Be the Refuge is a challenge, an invitation, a koan, a chant, whatever you want it to be. And kind of alluded to the kinship of all Buddhist practitioners across the world and across our country. And I was wondering if you could comment further on that and the significance of the title and really how you've seen that perhaps manifesting even just in the last 3 or so months since your book came out.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think first, just the word refuge evokes Buddhism because of the three gems that we take refuge in: the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, and in a way that unites Buddhists across not just this country, but across the globe. And the title is very much indebted to Aaron. So he actually, when he first started blogging, he was on a group blog called Dharma Folk, which I love the title. And then he got worried that his posts about sort of race and representation were becoming too dominant. So he started this new blog called Angry Asian Buddhist. And it was actually when he had cancer and was going through chemo that Aaron felt inspired to write another blog, a new blog, and he titled that Be the Refuge. And he was thinking in particular there in the hospital of how all of his actions, the ways he treated the nurses or the people who claimed to clean his room, or the ways he interacted with his friends, how that all of that created a sense of refuge for himself, for other people. His metta practice, his meditation practice, it created a sense of safety, of well-being. Sometimes our inactions also create refuge, right? When we refrain from doing something, when we lean into Buddhist ethics. And I remember he shared that first blog post with me saying, what do you think about it? And I just cried. I just said it was perfect. You need to publish this. And there's only one blog post on that blog actually. And I kind of think of us all as now engaged in this project of authoring the remaining blog posts of Be the Refuge, in the sense that Be the Refuge is very open and expansive. It is all those things that Liz mentioned. I've been sort of humbled and surprised to see the ways that the book has traveled and connected with people. People reacted differently. Sometimes it is kind of triggering. There's a flame on the cover after all. But overall, I think sometimes that trigger is actually a way to open up conversation, to not rest in a place of complacency, which is something that Aaron and I often talked about. He would worry about how it can be easy to slide into complacency. It can be easy to ignore injustice. So, how do we balance that, addressing that, but also making sure the types of work we do is sustainable, making sure that we are still feeling nourished by the work, that the work is still joy giving? And so, for me, it would partly be the refuge. And I sometimes joke that it's an alternative to a title, Go Meditate Now, which is sometimes just a wonderful thing to do. But there's many other ways to create refuge. We, as you saw in the May 4th gathering, chants, rituals, these have been part of Buddhist history and are very much part of Buddhist communities around the world for thousands of years, that these are incredible resources for people. I think of one of my mentors, Beth Goldring, who's a Zen Buddhist priest who did Buddhist chaplaincy work in Cambodia. And she had gone hoping to teach people meditation, people who are very ill with HIV, AIDS, with multi-drug resistant TB and the like. And actually, she quickly had to change her approach. She realized people were actually, first of all, just too sick to actually engage in meditation practice. And also, she was in Cambodia, so people found actually a lot of comfort in chants. She and her staff offered Reiki practice. All of these ways were ways that they created refuge for people. I mean, they also very simply and basically offered people food and medicine that they couldn't afford. So these were also ways that they created refuge. And I think of my many mentors and the many myriad ways that they create refuge. I think all of that is sort of woven into this book, but the book is really just a very small beginning. It's kind of an invitation for other people to share their stories, to weave their voices, and to practice together and to discover different ways of practice, perhaps ways of practice that might not be as familiar. Um, yes, so I feel like there's more I could say, but I appreciate that question.
Thanks, Chenxing. I also really appreciated your comment during that interview of inviting white convert Buddhist practitioners to visit temples that are predominantly Asian American practicing. That was a really great invitation and something, yeah, for us all for the white folks here to take into account. So thank you. Um, all right, everyone. So we are going to open up the floor. There are multiple ways for folks to offer questions. If you're not comfortable speaking up, that's totally fine. You can offer your question in the chat box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And there are multiple ways to raise your hand. You could physically raise your hand, and one of us will notice you, hopefully. There's also several automated ways to raise your hand. One is by going to reactions. If you've updated your Zoom lately, that's probably where you'll find the raise your hand option. Could also be in the participants box at the bottom. And another note is that we'd like to really center BIPOC questions if there are any practitioners of Asian descent also. So if there are any comments or questions from these folks, we'll be taking those first. But please, we welcome all questions, and thank you, Chenxing, for being willing to take them all. Jeff, I see your hand. Would you like to go first? Oh, you're muted, Jeff. Jeff, you're muted. Yes.
Thank you so much, Chenxing, for being here. My question really had to do with the ceremony last week, which was really powerful to witness. But I just wondered if you could say a few words about getting all those folks together from the different Asian Buddhist traditions and just sort of how that all came together. I know it doesn't relate so much to the book, but that's really been on my mind this week after being there last week.
Sure, and I think the two are very intertwined in a way, the book and the May 4th ceremony. I'm very much indebted to my co-organizers, Reverend Dr. Duncan Williams, as well as Dr. Funi Su. And Duncan in particular did a lot of the groundwork because he is based in LA. He is a Zen Buddhist priest there in Japantown. So he already had a lot of existing connections. And so there was, in a fairly short amount of time, a lot of phone calls and reaching out. Not everyone had, email access. So just a lot of groundwork on his part and a lot of, reaching out to different people. And I think not an easy task, certainly, but made easier by being in Los Angeles, which some people might consider to be one of the, the most diverse Buddhist cities in the world, perhaps even. So you have a lot of different traditions within a fairly concentrated space. And we also, tried to do outreach. So for example, unfortunately, we weren't able to have a Burmese Buddhist representative or someone from the Laotian community, although they also sent their blessings. So there were some constraints of geography. And as you all probably know, Southern California is very sprawling. And so not everyone was able to drive up to Higashi Honganji, the temple where the ceremony was actually live streamed. And of course, we also had to think about COVID guidelines. So we were trying to be really cautious, and the temple capacity is hundreds, but I think we had less than 70 people total, including the various monastics and priests and lay leaders, as well as the video production team and those of us who are volunteering. So it was somehow magically it all came together. Something about these different streams and webs, this kind of weaving metaphor keeps coming up, which I think is also very fitting for Buddhism. The word sutra itself means weaving. And so it was very powerful, certainly for myself. I think it was the first time I saw so many different Buddhist traditions in one place and heard so many chants in different languages. And I'm also very curious, if people in the audience don't have questions, but just want to share some of your own reactions and your own reflections on the event, very much welcome those as well, whether you want to speak them or write them in the chat. And it's something I'd happy to share with my organizers as well.
Thanks, Chenxing. Yeah, Cecilia, I saw you next.
Chenxing, so I used to live in California and lived in the Bay Area. So I really appreciated your book and loved the writing and the stories that you brought. And I wondered, as the book has gone out in the world and you've had feedback, and maybe because you focused on younger adults, have you heard feedback from Asian American Buddhists who are older and what their reaction is to the book? And then if I can sneak in a second question, is there anything you had to leave out of the book that you wish you could have included, but for one reason or another had to exclude? Thank you.
Thanks, Cecilia. Yeah, so to the first question, I have heard from older Asian American Buddhists, and it's striking to me that a lot of what's in the book still resonates with them. Of course, sort of this lens of generation is an important lens for my book, thinking about generation in multiple multiple ways. So for those who read the book, please bear with me, but just want to share with people who might not have read the book. So sometimes in American Buddhism, we have this idea that there's only two kinds of Buddhism. There's kind of these scholarly roots of this idea, like there's only white converts and Asian immigrants. And my book is kind of responding to that and wanting us to think about American Buddhism in more nuanced ways, thinking about kind of the multiple Buddhisms that are there. And one of many issues with two Buddhisms, besides obviously like excluding our Black and Latinx and Native American and mixed race friends, or being very awkward for Asian American converts like myself, like where do I fit into this binary? But something is that it sort of lumps people together in some kind of ageless way, as if converts and their children are the same, or as if Asian immigrants and their children are the same. And so there's a way in which we think about generation in that sense. There's also just what generation are we in the historical generation? Like I'm a millennial, right? Maybe some people here are identify as baby boomer or etc. So I think that there's both like resonances between these generations as well as obviously significant differences. But I've been, really intrigued by how, and of course in the book itself, there are some voices of older Asian American Buddhists as well. So it's been intriguing to hear how people have still resonated with much of what's in the book. And then as for your second question of things I had to leave out, well, there are so many more quotes, of course, than could go in the actual book. And it's already, I think, maybe almost a little overwhelming with the number of names and the number of people and stories. And then maybe this isn't so much like what I left out, but seems like there's so many more topics we could explore in more depth, whether that's Asian American Buddhists in more specific regional areas, or LGBTQIA plus Asian American Buddhists, or thinking more about the lens of gender and class, or there've been all these great ideas that come up from the book talk. And so again, I think of the book as just one very small beginning. It's not trying to do everything. It can't possibly try to do everything, but I hope it opens the gateway for more voices, more awareness, more sharing, more storytelling.
Thanks, Chenxing. So I'm getting some comments through direct message on the chat, so I'm going to share some of those with you. This is from our Sangha member, Catherine. She says that she attended the talk, the discussion that you participated in through Barry Center for Buddhist Studies with Reverend Williams in March. And so this is her question based on that experience. She says, I think there was a mention of white practitioners of Buddhism using Asian language and pronunciation in ways that were offensive. I've practiced in a Soto Zen community where the abbot was taught by a Japanese teacher in the 60s and 70s. There are chants done in both English and Japanese that may have perhaps cadence or inflection that may be borrowed from Japanese. Committed practitioners take a Japanese spiritual name. Is any of this, in your opinion, appropriation or otherwise disrespectful? She says she's very eager to learn and appreciates your time.
Thank you so much for that question, Catherine. Yeah, this question comes up a lot, and I think it's just a really complex one. This idea of where do we draw the line between cultural appreciation, as one of my interviews put it, and cultural appropriation. I think that, it's almost like context really matters. I think that's a really important thing to remember. And that alas, I don't think there's a magic 8-ball we can shake and input, 3 or 4 variables and say, was this offensive or was this not? In other words, it's all very nuanced, right? We're thinking about dynamics of power are very much part of this equation. Also, I think it's good to recognize that there's a spectrum, right? There's obviously things that we all very clearly know are offensive when we see that, for example, Buddhist temples being vandalized or Buddhist statues being desecrated, right? This is of a magnitude and a type of harm that's different than, let's say, someone dressing up as a monk for Halloween. I don't know, just putting that example. And then these issues of appropriation also play out differently in Native American communities, in the Black community. And so I think actually I've been hoping to write an article about this because it's a really difficult question to answer in the span of a few minutes like we have now for this question. And so I think just the very fact that you're asking this question is so important, that we're raising more awareness and having more sensitivity about the ways all of us, like every single one of us, has certain privileges, and there are certain contexts in which we don't have privileges, and understanding that kind of dance and trying to be more respectful in the ways we act. So, I mean, personally, I would certainly never say like, oh, it's blanketly offensive if a person of X heritage like has an Asian name, or to me, I don't agree with that, because Buddhism is a universal religion. It melds into each culture that it takes on. And so I can't certainly speak for all Asian American Buddhists, but that's just certainly for myself, understanding that part of a history of change and adaptation is very much a part of what's made Buddhism successful over 2,600 plus years. And so I often think about what are ways that we can be just respectful and engaged. And when we make a mistake, or when we inadvertently cause harm, advertently or inadvertently, how do we make amends for that harm? Right. I think those are all important questions of how do we continue to engage? So I think that, alas, it's not something like off a checklist that we just get to say, oh, I took a training and now I'm never gonna, really have to deal with this again. I think it's more about a practice of ongoing engagement, of sensitivity, of sometimes just asking people, getting feedback, like, was that offensive? Something that I might think is very benign might actually have felt offensive to someone else or been a microaggression. And I think it's always such a gift when people can offer that feedback. So even if it's very easy to become defensive, I totally get that. And I've been there. But I think actually when I take a step back, I remember what a gift it is to get that kind of feedback, to help people and help me look into kind of my blind spots, or the places that I may not be as aware.
Thanks, Chenxing. Yeah, I have one more comment. I think this is just a comment, so I'll read it. Nancy Elizabeth writes that the ceremony on May 4th was enriching, emotionally moving, and inspirational. I was so grateful that IMCC made this possible for members of the Sangha. I'm also so grateful for everyone else that made it possible, including you, by which she means you, Chenxing. So that's a comment. Are there any more? Yeah, I see that Susan Stone has your hand raised. Would you like to go ahead, Susan?
Hello, Chenxing. Thank you for being here. I do have a question, and I'm wondering if you can outline, is there a pattern of affiliation in Buddhist Sanghas amongst Asian American Buddhists? Do they belong mainly to intergenerational Asian Sanghas? Or are they also predominantly part of predominantly white convert Sanghas?
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, so, I'm not a sociologist or a statistician, so I'm afraid I can't give you particular numbers, but I appreciate that your question actually highlights the diversity of this big umbrella term, Asian American Buddhist, because it's sort of like all of the above. So my book is structured into 4 parts, and the first part is called Trailblazers. So these are predominantly interviewees who are Japanese American, or they might be mixed ethnicity, mixed race, but they come from the Jodo Shinshu tradition, which has been in this country for multiple generations. So certainly for them, they are part of these intergenerational sanghas that have been around for a long time, since the 19th century in this country. And then the second part of my book is called Bridge Builders. And here I'm really focused on second generation Buddhists, people whose parents immigrated to this country and raised them within the Buddhist faith. So again, many of these temples are also intergenerational, although unlike the Jodo Shinshu temples, I would say it can sometimes be difficult for second generation Asian American Buddhists to feel totally at ease in these countries, often because of issues, for example, of a language barrier. So with the Jodo Shin tradition, now that we have 4th, 5th, 6th generation Japanese Americans, there's still Japanese chants as part of their program, as part of their temples and sanghas, but many of the Dharma talks are conducted in English. There's youth groups. There's a lot of infrastructure there to support ongoing generations. And depending on the second generation temple, whether, this might be someone who's Cambodian or Lao or Taiwanese or Chinese or Thai, or there's Sri Lankan, there's such a wide diversity here. Depending on the resources their temple has, they may have youth groups or youth summer camps, they may not. So there are some people who grew up there who are continuing to be part of those temples, or maybe have gone on to explore other temples. And then the third part of my book, which I call First Gen, so I can make a note to explain what that means, but that's focused more on Asian Americans, kind of like myself, who weren't raised Buddhist. My parents are atheist. And so we came to Buddhism often through predominantly white meditation traditions or through mindfulness. I suspect that if we looked at Gen Z Buddhists these days, a very diverse and diversifying group, many of them, I suspect their gateway into Buddhist practice might be through secular mindfulness. So there's really kind of a wide mix. And I would add that some people move between these kind of rough categories that I've just presented. That's why part 4 of my book, which I call Refuge Makers, kind of weaves together these different voices. And so many people like Aaron have been to, all sorts of different sanghas, right? So yeah, I think that's a helpful reminder that it's very hard to, I think this is true for any group of Buddhists, really, any racialized group. You can't just assume just because of the color of the person's skin, the way they look, that you have a good guess on what their Buddhist history was, right? Just because I'm Chinese American and I'm Buddhist now, you can't assume that I was raised in a Chinese Buddhist community. I wasn't. And so for me, doing this project, it was actually very just a sense of that awe-inspiring to see wow, there's actually such diversity. And this also reminds me that white Buddhist as a category is not a monolith. Black Buddhist as a category is not a monolith. And my final point is, since I promised I would explain this term first gen, so I actually got this idea from one of my interviewees, Noel Alumit. He actually runs an AAPI Sangha that I'll be zooming into after this meeting with all of you. But he, during our interview, came up with this notion that, he said, I identify as a first gen American Buddhist in the sense that I'm the first person in my family here in America to be Buddhist in America. So he was raised Catholic and Filipino. So he's like, and actually this term has resonated with quite a few people. It's not like you have to be Asian American to be a first gen American Buddhist, for example, but it is, I think, important to remember that there are lots of first gen Asian American Buddhists out there, and that their experiences are affected by the ways that we are racialized in this country, that it may not always feel totally comfortable to be in a community where very few people look like us. Or, when I started exploring Buddhism 15 years ago, there were times when it felt like Asian cultures or heritages or languages weren't acknowledged at all. And I think that's really shifted over the past 15 years. So this is kind of a long answer to your question, Susan, but I hope that I was able to address it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chenxing. I have another question here through the chat. This is from our Sangha member, Mimi. There's 2 parts, actually. So the first is, have you had any feedback from the folks you interviewed about how they were impacted by participating in your research? And kind of a follow-up to that is, do you have any plans to follow up with the participants in the future to see how their spiritual journey unfolds?
Thanks, Mimi. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, when I read, I mentioned Alyssa, who was interviewee number 6. So we are still friends to this day. Actually, a few of my interviewees ended up coming to our wedding. So I can say yes, like many of us have kept in touch. And I think the impacts, it's different. Of course, some people I've, of course, lost touch with, but those I've stayed in touch with, I think we've been reflecting on how remarkable it's been, even in 2020, 2021, to actually see raised the rising levels of awareness about, I think, Asian Americans broadly and also Asian American Buddhists specifically. And I think this is also very much connected to Black Lives Matter and the kind of solidarities that are being developed between Black Lives Matter, Stop AAPI Hate. Just it seems like the overall level of consciousness and education and willingness of people to talk about issues of race has really, that it feels different to me than, a decade or 2 decades ago. So yes, yeah, there's things I could say for each person individually, but it's been really great. One of my interviewees is in the process of creating a Buddhist inspired school in New York City. Later this month, we'll be doing a retreat, a half-day retreat sponsored by the Young Buddhist Editorial, which is a group of young adults in the Jodoshin tradition, but it's really open to a lot of people. And I think we have 15 different panelists speaking throughout that day, and just finding these spaces to gather and talk about these issues. I think that's so much of the work, and having it be fun, like grabbing a cup of tea and just sharing what we know. So I think that I feel in that spirit, there's a sense of like wanting to form ongoing spiritual friendships and have them continue and kind of see what kind of projects we can co-create together based on the kinds of needs we see in the community. And then in terms of plans to follow up, I suppose there's both keeping in touch and, just trying to support projects here and there as I can. But really, I think, again, I'm just one person, and there's so many Asian American Buddhists out there. Sometimes the struggle is just to find each other and see each other or be recognized. And so the book hopes to just lower those barriers a little, those barriers for us to connect. And I think also to really create solidarities, not just like inter-Asian American Buddhists, but of course across these racial boundaries, across boundaries of different lineage as well. Yes, so I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Chenxing. I've got another question on the chat, but perhaps is there anybody who wants to raise a hand? And yeah, Bev, I think I see you.
Yes. Hi. I'm so appreciative of you really making it so clear. History, complexity, diversity. I'm just very appreciative of what you're sharing in your book. And to build on your last answer, I'm curious where you're finding, and I know I'm using broad terms there's lots of nuances here, but where you're finding that Asian American Buddhists and non-Asian American Buddhists are finding commonality, are coming together. What's that look like for you?
Yeah. Oh gosh, yeah, there's so many ways, right? The May 4th gathering, if you looked closely at the procession not everyone is of Asian heritage in that gathering, for example. And so in that sense, I think we united over chant and ritual. Obviously meditation brings together people of all different kinds of backgrounds. So there's the ways that the practices unite us, the teachings unite us, but also kind of an impulse to address suffering, I think, right? These very broad things, I think these specific projects. When I was there, it was my first time on a plane and goodness, like almost a year and a half, I think, and flying from San Francisco to Little Tokyo. And as we were preparing for the event, Duncan noted, oh, this is the stretch that actually they did a silent march, Buddhists for Black Lives Matter. And that also brought together people of a lot of different backgrounds, right? And so I think there's actually so many places that people come together around environmental activism, right? Not just around issues of racial and social justice. I see people coming together to address sexual abuse in different Buddhist sanghas, which is also a point that brings pain. So I think there's a way in which Buddhism really can help us see clearly different forms of suffering. And most these like there is racialized suffering, and then there is suffering that touches all of us, kind of regardless of our race. And I think Buddhism serves as a common ground for us there. So I actually think there's really quite a lot out there, and I see the ways in which magazines like Tricycle and Lion's Roar are doing more to actually be more inclusive of the diversity of different Buddhist traditions, different, groups that have both affinity groups and like big Sangha groups, reading groups, for example. So I actually think I see a lot of different meeting points. And then I guess finally, I would just say that I'm always a big advocate of like sharing food, having tea, just simple human things like that doesn't discriminate. And it's a good way just for us to get to know each other more, whether they're one-on-one or bigger group conversations. So I think that in a way, perhaps part of Be the Refuge is a kind of like reimagining. If we've inherited certain stories about how there's two Buddhisms and we're isolated and race is a barrier, all of these things, we can retell that story and we can embody that story differently. We can say like, no, actually American Buddhism looks like the May 4th gathering. It looks us coming together to make a stand, make a statement, take a stand against types of suffering and to heal together and do so in a way that's very much rooted in our Buddhist ethics, our teachings.
Thanks. So this question, I think you've partially answered it, but maybe I'll just ask it in case there's something more to say, a good follow-up to the discussion. This is from a member of our Sangha named David. He says, as you know, white convert communities have privileged personal transformation and social disengagement. Can you comment on the relationship between Buddhism and social justice work from your perspective?
Yeah, I think, Anne Glag does really great work on this sort of focus on the personal rather than the communal and social disengagement. I think I would say that's not true across the board, right? I think there's many white convert communities that are actually very socially engaged and also not just focused on personal transformation. So I don't know, I'm trying to think, what can I say to this? Certainly there has been, I mean, I think if there was a lot of resistance to talking about race, I wouldn't be here. So maybe this isn't really an audience that is going to be very combative about this. I think there is certainly, and I can empathize kind of, not just white Buddhists. I think there are people who are Asian American Buddhists who might feel this way, who are Black Buddhists who might feel this way. In other words, who might feel that, maybe race should not be as central, right? And I actually feel I can be empathetic to that view because there's a way in which, if we look at Buddhist teachings, it helps us understand the kind of constructed illusory nature of race in a sort of ultimate kind of way. And I would argue that there's a way to hold that as a truth, but then also to hold the truth that on a subjective level, race can cause a lot of harm to people, and that harm can even manifest in our sanghas. And so we do kind of have an ethical responsibility, a responsibility to address that. But of course, our own capacities to address that work look differently, right? We're all at different points of understanding and awareness and learning. We're all still learning together. And so for me, I think just remembering, like trying not to say like, oh, this group, I'm just like judging them for where they are or aren't along some kind of metric, but rather trying to understand, so if they do kind of have this feeling like any conversation about race is harmful or divisive or distracting, where does that belief, where does that thought come from? What is the history of their particular community or the teachings that they're relying on that make them feel that way? And then can we find some common point of dialogue for those of us who do feel that actually Buddhism and social justice, that there is a lot of important overlap there? For example, even just the Bodhisattva vow of wanting to reduce suffering. For some people, that really means wanting to reduce racial suffering in this country. And as many people have pointed out, it's kind of this heavy karma that we've inherited in America, the kind of racial trauma. And we can say that, oh, like I didn't cause this, I didn't ask for this to be inherited. Well, we didn't, but that's the reality. And we benefit from many things that we didn't ourselves contribute to. So I think there's a way in which we can take on a responsibility of addressing certain types of suffering, while being mindful of our own limits and of our own capacities and where we feel the work is most, again, sustainable and life-giving. So I always hope that for people who are moved to the work, that it doesn't feel like a chore or like some kind of bitter medicine we have to swallow, but that we can remember the work of alleviating suffering is never done alone. It's always done in community, and that in times when we're tired, we can rest. And also in times that when we're overwhelmed, we can lean into the Sangha, into also the Dharma, the Buddha, right? We can find our refuge and find ways to refuel. But I guess obviously personally, I think that there's a lot of important overlap between these two things, or again, I wouldn't be here talking with you today.
Thanks, Chenxing. That was really beautiful. Thank you. Yeah,
I think I see Judy waving. So
oh, thank you. Judy Blooms, please.
Bless you, bless you. Chenxing, it's wonderful to listen to you and to learn where your heart is. I wonder, are you currently doing a blog or considering it? It would be great to kind of keep up with you and your journey.
Thanks, Judy. Yeah, I have a newsletter that I send out, so people can sign up just at my website, www.chenxinghan.com. And I am, so there I try to keep people updated about the various articles I have. And most of my writing is freely available on my website. And I've also been working on a second book that really focuses on my education as a Buddhist chaplain. And so I'm very impressed by people who can blog very regularly. But I think for me, I tend to write more in terms of articles and then that newsletter, and then trying to pour energy into other projects as well. And also, it's very easy to contact me through my website. So just want to invite you all not to feel shy, and yeah, to feel free to contact me through that avenue as well.
Thanks, Chenxing. I think, Shannon, did you have a question?
I did. I'm hoping this isn't too much of an overlap, so so please stop me if you need to. But I did really love your book. It made me feel a lot of things that were really important. Just as a just as a member of this community, and just thinking about my whiteness amidst a lot of whiteness, and how that relates to Buddhism and just the story there and the lineage there. But I was just curious, have you come across any white converts, sanghas that you just felt like were really doing something particularly awesome in terms of just like pushing past that layer of white supremacy and, really being equitable, and just, anything that you've seen that just especially like moved your heart, or that would be helpful for us to hear here on our journey?
Well, and I'm not just saying this because I'm here with you guys, but I was so touched that you had an all sangha big read and chose to focus my book. I mean, that was a huge surprise for me. Oh gosh, I don't know if there's a specific one. I feel like there's all these collective efforts, just so many people inviting different speakers. I feel like I'm learning a lot from there. And I should also add, like, this might help contextualize things for people. So March 2020, last year, I was still living in Bangkok, actually, with my partner. So we were based in Southeast Asia for much of the time that I wrote this book. So it's actually really interesting to me that I wrote a book about Asian American Buddhists while actually primarily being not in America. And I think actually in some ways I needed that kind of distance from the US and that kind of space, protected space to write. And it was also an experience where, I'm not Thai, I'm not Cambodian. My Thai and Khmer are sadly atrocious, but I was still a racial majority in those countries and a religious majority. I mean, Thailand and Cambodia are about 95% or more Buddhist. And so there's just a way in which Buddhism could be woven into everyday life. You would walk past so many temples, even just on the way to the grocery store or something like that. And so I mentioned that, though, because in a way, my introduction back into American Buddhism has been completely over Zoom. We came back to the Bay Area thinking we would be here just for a month and then would go back to Bangkok. Obviously, we never returned to Bangkok. Magically, we were able to get our stuff back after 4 or 5 months of waiting. But it's been quite a surreal experience, actually, to be zooming into a lot of different sanghas. And I think a lot of them are doing this work, this hard work, this long-term work, right? Of this uncomfortable work of talking about race and just inviting different speakers and creating these groups. So it's actually hard to pinpoint a certain one of them. And I also feel like, it's true that I haven't actually even been in person to an American Buddhist Sangha, especially not a predominantly white convert Buddhist Sangha, in actually quite a very long time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chenxing. I think, Dan, you had your hand raised. Did you want to ask a question?
Well, Shannon kind of asked sort of the question I was going to ask, but it sort of related to that. First of all, I really enjoyed the book. Thank you so much for it. And one of the things I really enjoyed was, that you touched on so many different traditions of Buddhism. And of course, here we practice in the Insight tradition. And so I was wondering, I got the impression you'd been to a number of Insight centers over the years. And I was just kind of wondering whether there's anything that you've seen when you go into a Insight center that really feels like a way of incorporating or acknowledging the Asian origin and heritage that some maybe insight centers or predominantly white sanghas have done, that feel to you like when you see that or feel it, feels particularly respectful and appropriate?
Yeah, I think I've certainly heard people talk about how when they see sometimes even just as simple as like the artwork, or if there's an altar, or if there's that kind of statuary, I think even if being able to see, Asian people, I mean, first, of course, it feels welcoming if there are living, breathing people of Asian heritage or of different heritages. But then beyond that, if there are, statues that reflect that, if there is an altar, right? I read about this in the memoir that I'm working on, but I remember a moment of there's just a very small Buddhist statue, and I didn't grow up, with these statues, and I didn't grow up bowing to them, but having spent more time in both Asian American Buddhist communities, I remember just feeling moved to bow to that statue and feeling really self-conscious in that moment. So I think it's also in what people are doing, right? Are some people in the community actually comfortable with bowing? Because often in inside spaces, maybe that's not. And I'm not saying people have to be, but I think seeing a kind of diversity that can feel very inviting. I think most people, we have people take off their shoes. So I think that's a simple thing, but that also feels very inviting and accessible to a lot of people. But it's also like, what's on the altar? Might there be fruit, or might there be some flowers, something that might actually be familiar to people as well? And I'm trying to think. And I think also what's inviting, I've heard some people say is, of course, just though it's hard, not having assumptions that a person was or wasn't raised Buddhist, or also not having assumptions that they know where the bathroom is. Like, that's also very inviting, apparently, letting people know where the bathroom is. There's all these like little ways that people can feel invited. Yeah, if there's Asian script, whether that might be in Chinese or another language. I know I've heard people say that they realized it was years before, at one point, one of their meditation teachers happened to explain the meaning of the character for compassion. And they had a moment where they felt, oh, is this okay? Like, of course it's okay. But I think it just speaks to, again, the absence of markers of Asianness. And I would say also food is a big part of that. So, if they remember being at one predominantly white Zen Sangha a couple of months ago, talking about how if most people, get their snacks from Whole Foods and that's how they have food together, that's going to look really different than, let's say, having a big potluck. And if you have people who know how to make really yummy food from different Asian cultures in that tradition. So food also feels very important. So I think it's just a way in which when people can feel acknowledged, when they feel like it's safe to express myself culturally and religiously, right? Especially when many of us were like teased or made fun of because of the types of food we ate, or weren't even always comfortable bringing that to school, for example. I think just being kind of aware of those dynamics, and then are there ways to bring that forth in an organic way. I think, again, what for me the May 4th ritual really emphasized was just how little things can mean so much, right? The smell of incense, or just like something small and concrete, or even things that maybe I didn't grow up with, but I know that that statue of Amida Buddha means so much. And of course, that's not necessarily appropriate for an insight center, right? You have to decide what feels appropriate for your particular Buddhist center as well. And so I think a beautiful and fun way to like answer this question is just to visit other centers and visit different centers and notice like, oh, what do they do that's similar to what we do? And also that's different than what we do. I think we have so much to learn from each other. And the best way to learn is kind of just to be there in person and then ask questions and be curious and like be in an embodied way, like being able to see and smell and engage all our senses in those spaces together.
Thanks, Chenxing. And I just want to lift up, so grateful for everyone's questions, and Chenxing, really grateful to you for your willingness to engage with us on these kinds of questions. Really appreciate that. So I just realized I haven't been scrolling to the second page of my folks. So if you've been raising your hand and I haven't seen you, might you do that again so that I can? Yeah, I thought so. Hey, Bill, would you like to? Good question.
Well, thank you again for coming tonight, and thank you for being impetus for the celebration memorial. For me, it emphasized, two words. One is interconnectedness, and the other is Sangha. And in a sense, it kind of blew my mind that I hadn't really felt or it had an embodied sensation of being part of a Sangha that was global and as diverse as it is, and also, of course, timeless in 2,500 years or whatever. And I wondered whether that was just a moment in time for a particular event, or whether there was something there that could go on, some way that our communities could start to interact with each other, even if because we're geographically disparate and many other things, to start interacting more organizationally together going forward.
Yeah, we absolutely hope that the event has inspired people to continue to gather, and you know your own region best, and you may be surprised to discover like what other Buddhists are around, and to create, whether it's coming together for Wesak, for a Buddhist holiday, or coming together around another matter, right? Like I think, to me, it just showed the possibilities that I think there's so many more possibilities of creating these bonds of spiritual friendship, of celebrating our kind of Buddhist kinship with each other. And I totally understand that, it's hard enough to run one's own Sangha, but I think that trying to just find occasions, even if it's a few times a year, to start to plant those seeds of spiritual friendship, we really hope that people do that. And I definitely don't think it's a one-time thing. I think it's something that really people throughout Buddhist history have done this, but that it's something that I hope people feel called to do and enjoy doing. I mean, we're excuse me, we're such a minority, right, in this country. If only about 1% of us are Buddhists in this country. So it seems to me that the more we can meet other Buddhists, the better.
Thanks, Chenxing. I think we're all kind of on the same wavelength. Right before, Bill, you asked your question, I got a question from Helen that's related, but wanted to offer this as well. She says, what might Chenxing think about a Sangha like ours somehow partnering with a more Asian Buddhist Sangha to perhaps learn, do, practice, be refuges to each other, especially when we have this type of technology available? I think she means Zoom. So I know you probably already answered that, but I just wanted to, if you have additional things to say, and also recognize that Helen and Bill and others of us are also on the same wave.
Yeah, that's great, Helen. Yeah, I love that idea, right? It's just, we come up with ideas and we experiment. I mean, really, the book I wrote was an experiment, and May We Gather was, I think, kind of an experiment. We had no idea what would happen and, how it would come together. But I think of in Buddhism, how we think about causes and conditions, how we think about karma. And so trying to plant these sorts of wholesome seeds, or these positive seeds of karma, I think it's quite remarkable. It's what can come from that.
So I think we can have time for one more brief comment or offering of question, and then we'll have a short closing, if there are any more. Happy to look for hands or see any more folks chatting. I don't see anyone, so I think I'll say thank you so much, Chenxing, and note to everyone that Chenxing is here of her own really generous offer of her time. And so we are accepting dana for her, any dana that is, dana means generosity. Oftentimes it's the word we use in this tradition and in many traditions. And so if you would like to offer some generosity to Chenxing for her time and effort, you're free to do so, and we will pass that on to her. Also, she's been really generous to get us a coupon code for her book, which is in effect right now. So if you have not yet bought the book and still want to, I believe you can get 35% off of that. Judy has that information. It's also in the latest newsletter that we have. So we'll either put that in the chat or send it out to folks later. So I would just like us to end perhaps with a noticing. We can do this with our eyes open or eyes closed, whatever feels good for you. I'm personally noticing just a lot of community, a lot of a feeling of communal energy. And I think that word energy in particular. It's noticing what has been generated here this evening. It might be a feeling in our bodies of connection, perhaps. Connection within this particular Sangha, but also connection to Buddhist practitioners and contemplatives in this country, in many, many different Sanghas. And also perhaps a connection to this really expansive lineage of Buddhist practitioners throughout time and space. And how does that feel to know that we are, the small Sanghas continuing that lineage? There are many Sanghas continuing that lineage. And that there is a unitive quality about our experience. So noticing that and really offering some heartfelt gratitude. We might notice the region of our hearts as a practice and noticing any expansion that's present there. Offering that up to our own Sangha, and especially to our guest, to Chenxing, for her time and her work that she has given to the world, really. So may the energy, may the efforts of our time together this evening, our contemplation, our discussion, may this work towards the benefit of all beings, past, present, and future. So thank you again to everyone for your presence, for your time, for your energy, especially Chenxing. Wow, thank you. It's been great.
Great evening, Liz. Thanks, Chenxing.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Chenxing. Thank you,
That was
Liz.
Take
Thank
care.
you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chenxing.
So much, everyone.
Thank
Thank you. Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.